Section 1. The weight of the earth. The silence in the old farmhouse was a physical presence, thick and heavy, broken only by the rhythmic, tired groan of the porch swing as Elias Thorne set it in motion with the scuffed toe of his work boot. Each creak was a beat in the dirge of the dying day, a sound that seemed to say alone, alone, alone. Before him, the land of his forefathers stretched out under the relentless glare of the late summer sun, a vast panorama of faded gold and brittle brown that mirrored the desolation taking root in his own soul. At 72 years old, Elias felt every one of them etched into the marrow of his bones, a constant, dull ache that was as much a part of him as his own name. The Thorne family farm, a 4-generation legacy of calloused hands and stubborn faith, was now a dying entity, and he was the weary, heartbroken caretaker presiding over its final, gasping days. The spring had been unkind, a vicious late frost nipping the tender promise of the apple blossoms in the bud, and the summer had proven a cruel and parsimonious master, withholding rain until the very soil seemed to crack and gasp for a single drop of mercy. The creek that had once ribboned its way through the western acreage, a shimmering, lively vein of life, was now just a scar of bleached gravel and cracked, dry mud in the earth. He could see it all from this porch, this vantage point he had shared with Clara for over 40 years. Every sagging fence post, every patch of aggressive thistle choking out the struggling wheat, every visible rib on the flanks of the few cattle he had left. The knowledge of this failure was a lodestone tied around his neck, pulling him down into a deep he couldn't escape. On the heavy oak desk inside, just visible through the dusty screen door, lay the latest envelope from the bank. He didn't need to open it to know its contents. The formal, crisp paper and the stark, unforgiving red numbers were already seared into his mind's eye. Foreclosure. It was no longer a vague threat lurking on the horizon. It was a storm that had finally broken, and he was standing alone in the downpour with no shelter in sight. His son, Michael, a man of clean logic and sterile spreadsheets who lived 3 hours away in the city, had laid it out with painful, impeccable clarity on his last visit. "Dad," he'd said, his voice gentle but firm, filled with a pragmatic sorrow. "You've leaned on your own strength your whole life. You've worked harder than any man I know. But look where it's gotten you. The numbers don't lie. Leaning on your own understanding has brought us here. The logical, the only sensible thing to do now is to sell." The words had felt like a betrayal of everything he and Clara had built, yet they were undeniably, painfully true. His strength was gone, his understanding had failed, and his hope was as parched and barren as the fields stretching out before him. The verse from Isaiah, the one Clara had loved so much, the one she'd cross-stitched and framed in the kitchen, echoed faintly in a distant, locked chamber of his memory, but it felt like a taunt, a melody from a life he was no longer privileged to live. "They shall mount up with wings as eagles." He felt nothing but the leaden, inescapable pull of gravity, anchoring him to an earth that was crumbling beneath his feet. He was not soaring. He was in a freefall, and the ground was rushing up to meet him with terrifying speed. The eagle's wings were a fantasy. The dust was his reality. Section 2. The Whisper in the Dust. The interior of the farmhouse was a museum dedicated to a life lived in full, each object a silent relic of a happier, louder past. Elias moved through the dim living room, his footsteps silent on the worn Persian rug whose patterns had been faded by decades of sunlight. His eyes, almost of their own volition, avoided the empty armchair by the fireplace, the one where Clara would sit and knit in the evenings, her needles clicking a gentle, comforting rhythm against the vast silence of the prairie nights. It had been 2 years since the cancer had stolen her, a slow, cruel thief that had taken her light and left him with this profound, echoing emptiness. The grief was a constant companion now, a hollowed-out space inside him that nothing could fill, not work, not silence, not even the well-intentioned visits from Michael. On his bedside table, next to a half-full glass of water that had gathered a fine layer of dust, sat the thick family Bible. Its black leather cover was cracked and supple with age, the gilded edges of its thin pages worn soft and fuzzy from generations of devout, seeking hands. Clara's hands had been the last to turn them regularly. Since her passing, Elias hadn't been able to bring himself to open it. The vibrant, living faith that had come so naturally to her, that had been the bedrock of her gentle strength, felt like a foreign language to him now, one he had forgotten in the cold, gray aftermath of his loss. But tonight, the silence was too profound, the despair too complete, the weight of the unopened bank envelope too heavy to bear alone. With a sigh that seemed to come from the very depths of his being, he lifted the heavy book onto his lap. It felt both familiar and alien, a weight of history and hope. It fell open with a soft whisper of parting pages, as if by its own volition, to the book of Isaiah, near the middle. And there, on the page, in Clara's unmistakable, elegant, looping script, underlined in a now-faded blue ink, was the verse, "But they that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings as eagles. They shall run and not be weary, and they shall walk and not faint." Elias read the words slowly, and then read them again, his lips moving silently, shaping the familiar syllables. "Wait," he murmured aloud, the word tasting like ash and bitterness in his mouth. "I am waiting. I'm waiting for the end. I'm waiting for the bank to send the final notice. I'm waiting for the auctioneer's gavel to fall on my life. What other waiting is there?" The glorious promise of eagle's wings felt like a cruel mockery, a taunt from a heaven that felt closed to him. He was a creature of the earth, bound to it by failure and debt and grief, his wings long since clipped by the harsh scissors of reality. The idea of running without weariness was a fantasy for younger men, men whose bodies weren't betraying them, whose hearts weren't a stone in their chests, whose futures weren't collapsing into dust. He closed the Bible with a soft, definitive thud, the promise feeling like just another weight, another burden he was too tired to carry. Yet, as he lay in the dark later, the rough sheets against his skin, the words wouldn't leave him. They circled in his mind, a stubborn, haunting refrain against the roaring chorus of his doubts. Wait upon the Lord. The preposition snagged on his consciousness. It was a passive verb, but it hinted at an active, attentive posture, like a servant waiting for a master's instruction, not a prisoner waiting for a sentence. It wasn't about waiting for something specific to happen, but waiting on someone specific. The distinction was subtle, almost philosophical, but in the fertile ground of his desperation, it planted a seed, a tiny, fragile shoot of something that wasn't quite hope, but was no longer complete and utter despair. It was the first, faint stirring of a different kind of fight, one not fought with muscles and sweat, but with patience and a stubborn, flickering spark of trust. Section 3. The Discipline of Inaction. The morning sun offered no reprieve, its brilliant, cheerful light only serving to illuminate the dust motes dancing in the stagnant air and the grim, unvarnished reality of the farm's decline. The bank's notice still lay on the desk, a white rectangle of finality that seemed to pulse with a silent, demanding energy. Every instinct honed over a lifetime of self-reliance, of fixing what was broken, of forcing the land to yield to his will, screamed at him to act, to call Michael, to call a realtor, to get in the truck and drive to the bank and beg for more time, to do something, anything, to seize control of the spiraling situation and wrestle it into submission. Leaning on his own understanding, a philosophy that had served him well for decades, demanded a logical, decisive action to mitigate the coming disaster. It was the way of the world, the way of a man who provided and protected. But as he stood there, the memory of the verse and the faint, lingering impression of Clara's steadfast faith held him back like an invisible hand on his shoulder. What if his understanding was the problem? What if the very act of striving, of trying to manhandle a solution into existence with his own diminished strength, was the very thing that was exhausting him, that was blinding him to any other possibility? The words "wait upon the Lord" presented a radical, counterintuitive alternative. It wasn't a strategy, it was a surrender. It was the hardest work he had ever contemplated. With a resolve that felt both foolish and strangely, profoundly peaceful, Elias made a decision. He would not make the call today. He would not sign any papers. He would not list the farm. For this one day he would simply wait. He would perform his chores not with the frantic, desperate energy of a man trying to single-handedly stave off the inevitable, but with the deliberate, mindful care of a steward tending to what was directly in front of him, moment by moment. It was the smallest, most insignificant act of defiance against the overwhelming tide of logic and despair. He went through the motions of the day, feeding the few remaining chickens whose clucks sounded lonely, checking on the beleaguered livestock that looked at him with placid, unknowing eyes, walking the fraying fence lines, but he did so with a new, heightened awareness. He was watching. He was listening not just with his ears, but with his whole being. He was, in his own clumsy, faltering way, waiting. The anxiety that usually gnawed at the edges of his consciousness, a constant, buzzing static, was still present, but it was quieter, as if he had taken a single step back from the edge of a precipice. The burden of the farm, the debt, the future had not vanished, but he felt, for the first time in years, that he was not carrying it alone. He had, in a way he couldn't fully articulate or even understand, placed a fragment of the weight elsewhere. The act of waiting itself became a form of work, a spiritual labor that was just as taxing, yet in a completely different way, as swinging a sledgehammer or baling hay under a hot sun. He was cultivating patience in a field that had been overgrown with the thorny weeds of panic. Section 4: The Prophet and the Past. 3 days into his strange, self-imposed vigil, a familiar, dust-covered sedan he recognized as Pastor Samuel Miller's pulled into the gravel driveway, crunching to a halt near the rusting hulk of the old Alice Chalmers tractor that hadn't run in 5 years. Elias watched from the porch, not with annoyance, but with a curious sense of anticipation, as if he had been expecting this. Samuel stepped out, a man whose face was a roadmap of kindness, his hair a shock of brilliant white, his eyes holding a light that seemed untouched by the world's weariness. He was the retired pastor who had buried Clara, who had spoken words of such profound comfort that day that Elias had almost, for a moment, believed them. "Elias," Samuel said, his voice a warm, steady baritone that fit the morning like a well-worn glove. He didn't offer platitudes or hollow greetings. "I was praying this morning, and Clara's memory came to me with such force, such clarity. I felt I should stop by. No agenda, just to see how you're holding up." Elias, who had become somewhat reclusive in his grief, found himself nodding and gesturing toward the empty chair on the porch. "I've got coffee on," was all he said, but it was an invitation he hadn't extended to anyone in months. Over mugs of strong, black coffee, the conversation meandered, eventually turning, as it inevitably did, to the farm's struggles. Elias heard himself speaking, his voice low and rough, about the drought, the frost, the crushing debt. He spoke of his bone-deep fatigue, his sense of being a failure not just as a farmer, but as a custodian of his family's legacy. He even mentioned, his tone laced with the old hurt, Michael's advice to be logical and to stop leaning on a failing dream. Samuel listened, not with the pity Elias had come to dread from others, but with a profound, quiet empathy, his eyes never leaving Elias's face. When the flood of words finally subsided, Samuel nodded slowly, his hands wrapped around his warm mug. "Leaning on our own understanding is our default setting, Elias," he said, his gaze drifting out over the parched fields. "It's what feels safe, what feels like control. We trust our minds, our plans, our strength. And it's a good thing, a gift from God. But it has its limits. I've found, in my own life and in walking with others, that God often does his best work in the space we create when we finally reach the end of our own strength. It's the space where we finally stop telling him how to fix the problem and simply say, 'I trust you.'" He didn't offer easy answers or empty platitudes. He didn't promise a miraculous rain or a sudden financial windfall. He simply sat with Elias in his struggle, a living, breathing reminder of the faith Clara had held so dear, a faith that was not afraid of silence or doubt. His presence was a comfort, a tangible touch of grace in the isolated world of the farm, a well of cool water in the spiritual drought. He was the first concrete sign that waiting might not be a solitary endeavor. Section 5: The Green in the Cracks. Samuel's visit had been a balm, a moment of connection that had eased the tightness in Elias's chest. But the physical drought persisted, a tyrant refusing to relinquish its throne. The sky remained a hard, cloudless blue, and the wind that swept across the plains was hot and dry, carrying the scent of dust and despair. The creek bed was a glaring wound in the landscape. Yet, fortified by the conversation, Elias continued his routine of active waiting. He walked the land not as a general surveying a losing battle, but as a pilgrim looking for signs, however small. A few afternoons later, while walking the northern fence line, a task he performed with a new deliberateness, he noticed something peculiar, something he had walked past a dozen times without truly seeing. In a low-lying corner of the north pasture, a place where the land dipped into a small, sheltered hollow, the grass was noticeably, undeniably greener. It wasn't the lush emerald of a well-watered lawn, but it was a vibrant, living green that stood in stark, defiant contrast to the brittle, sun-bleached fields surrounding it. It was an oasis the size of a large room. Curiosity, a feeling he hadn't experienced in a long time, sparked within him. He unlatched the gate and walked toward it, his boots crunching on the dry grass before giving way to a softer, more resilient turf. He knelt, the bones in his knees protesting, and dug his fingers into the earth. It was cool. It was damp. There was moisture here, a secret reservoir that the sun's relentless gaze hadn't been able to find and steal away. He looked around, trying to find a source, a seep, a spring, anything. But there was nothing obvious. It was as if the land itself was holding onto this one small pocket of life, a hidden well of resilience. It wasn't a solution to his problems. The 10 acres of struggling wheat wouldn't be saved by this tiny patch. But it was a sign, a small, inexplicable, powerful sign, a pocket of life in the midst of death, a whisper of "I am here" in the overwhelming silence. It felt like a gift, a direct response to his fledgling attempt to wait. That night, he read Isaiah 40 verse 31 again, the words illuminated by the warm glow of the bedside lamp. "They shall run and not be weary." He was a long, long way from running. He could barely muster a slow walk most days. But the green patch in the north pasture felt like the strength to take one more step. And then another. The weariness was still there, but it was no longer the whole of his story. The waiting was beginning to feel less like waiting for an end, and more like waiting for a beginning. A dawn he couldn't yet see but was starting to believe might come. The eagle was still earthbound, but it had felt, for the first time, the faint stirring of a wind beneath its wings. Section 6. The Tempest of Reason. The fragile, green-fringed peace Elias had cultivated was shattered a week later by the familiar, aggressive crunch of tires on gravel that signaled his son's arrival. Michael's city-sleek car looked like an alien spacecraft next to the rusting farm equipment. He emerged not with a greeting, but with a tablet in hand, his face a mask of grim urgency. "Dad," he began, dispensing with any pleasantries. "I got a call from the bank. The foreclosure process is officially moving forward. They're filing the paperwork next week." He thrust the tablet toward Elias, displaying a complex calendar filled with red deadlines. "Your inaction is going to cost you everything. You can't just wait and hope a miracle falls from the sky. That's not how the world works. That's not how anything works." The conversation that followed was a replay of their previous argument, but amplified, laced with a new layer of desperate frustration from Michael. He spoke of logic, of market realities, of cutting losses. He painted vivid, terrifying pictures of his father destitute, of the family name being attached to a humiliating public auction. Each word was a hammer blow on the anvil of Elias's newfound resolve. After Michael left, the storm of doubt descended with a vengeance. The porch swing felt like the seat of a fool. The green hollow seemed a pathetic, insignificant defiance against the monolithic force of financial law. Had he been a prideful old man, mistaking stubbornness for faith? Was his waiting just a spiritualized term for cowardice, a refusal to face the music? The memory of the verse felt thin, insubstantial, a wisp of smoke against the gale-force winds of Michael's impeccable logic. The renewed strength was a phantom sensation, utterly absent in the face of this fresh onslaught of reality. He felt the old weariness return, multiplied, a suffocating blanket. This was the deepest, most brutal test of his fledgling resolve, to trust in the midst of overwhelming contrary evidence, to wait when every sane part of him screamed for action, for control, for the bitter salvation of surrender. He spent a sleepless night, pacing the creaking floorboards, wrestling with God, with Clara's memory, with his own pride, and with the terrifying possibility that his son was right and he was throwing away his last chance at a secure end on a divine fantasy. The eagle's wings were not just clipped, they felt severed. Section 7. The stillness after the storm. By the time the first pale hint of dawn bled into the eastern sky, Elias was hollowed out. The anger, the fear, the frantic mental calculations had all burned themselves to ash, leaving him sitting slumped in his worn armchair, empty of everything but a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. He had no fight left. The arguments were spent. The well of his own understanding was not just dry, it was cracked and barren. In this absolute, surrendered silence, a thought surfaced. It wasn't an audible voice, but an impression that filled the void within him with a calm, clear certainty. You are waiting for an outcome. I am asking you to wait for me. The distinction was revolutionary. A key turning in a lock he hadn't even known existed. Elias sat up straight, his breath catching. He realized with stunning clarity that he had been waiting for a financial rescue, for a sudden downpour, for a deus ex machina to save the farm. He had been waiting for a what, not a who. He had been treating God as a divine problem solver, and the verse as a contractual promise for deliverance. But this was different. This was about the relationship itself. The promise of Isaiah 40 verse 31 wasn't primarily about the circumstances changing. It was about him changing. It was about the source of his strength being renewed from the inside out, regardless of whether the external drought persisted or not. The burden lifted not because the problem was solved, but because his relationship to the problem had been fundamentally shifted. He was not alone in it. The outcome was no longer his primary concern. The presence of God was. A profound, unshakable peace, deeper and more solid than any he had felt since Clara's death, settled over him. This was the foundation Samuel had spoken of. This was what it truly meant to wait upon the Lord. The eagle wasn't trying to fly from the ground. It was waiting for the thermal current that would lift it effortlessly. Section 8. The obedience of the shovel. With the new dawn came not a miraculous solution, but a new, quiet clarity. Waiting on the Lord, he now understood, did not mean passive paralysis. It meant a heart attuned, listening for direction, and then having the courage to act in obedience, no matter how small or illogical the step might seem. That morning, as he drank his coffee on the porch, the thought of the green hollow returned. But this time it was accompanied by a clear, persistent prompting, dig. It made no sense. Digging a well by hand was the work of a younger man, a fool's errand. He had no equipment, no guarantee of finding more than that small, damp pocket. It was the absolute opposite of leaning on his own understanding, which would have dismissed the idea outright. But the prompting was unshakable. It felt like the running the verse spoke of, not a frantic, fearful sprint, but a purposeful, obedient motion forward. This was his to do. He fetched his long-handled shovel and a pickaxe from the barn, tools that felt heavy and foreign in his aged grip, and walked back to the north pasture. He marked the center of the damp area and struck the earth. The first few inches were soft, but soon the shovel rang against hard, compacted clay. Sweat beaded on his forehead and trickled down his back within minutes. His shoulders and back screamed in protest. It was backbreaking, seemingly pointless labor, but with each shovelful of earth, he felt a strange, new energy. Not the frantic energy of desperation, but the steady, purposeful energy of obedience. He was no longer digging just for water. He was digging in response to a call. He was partnering with the promise, acting in faith that the one who directed him would also provide. He worked until his body could take no more. Then he rested and returned the next day. The hole grew deeper, slowly descending into the cool, dark earth. He told no one, not even Michael. This was between him and God, a silent testament of trust enacted one shovelful at a time. Section 9. The first fruit of trust. The work was agonizingly slow, a daily battle between his will and the unyielding earth. Elias fell into a rhythm. Early morning chores, a few dedicated hours of digging in the relative cool of the day, then rest and recovery in the afternoon. The hole grew to the depth of his knees, then his waist. His muscles ached with a constant, fiery protest, but it was a clean pain, the pain of labor, not the corrosive pain of despair. He began to notice a change in his own body. The weariness was still there, but it was layered with a newfound stamina, a resilience he hadn't felt in years. He was walking and not fainting in a very literal sense. After a week and a half of this solitary labor, the character of the soil began to change. The hard, orange clay gave way to a darker, looser earth mixed with gravel, then to a damp, sandy layer. One afternoon, as he drove the pickaxe down with a grunt, he heard a different sound. A soggy, yielding thud. His heart leaped into his throat. He scrambled down into the chest-deep hole with his shovel and carefully scooped away the loose, wet earth. And there it was, not a gushing geyser, but a slow, steady seep. A small pool of muddy water began to well up from the bottom, clearing as it rose. It was water, cold, fresh, life-giving water, slowly filling the space he had made for it. He knelt at the edge of the hole, his calloused hands trembling as he reached down and touched the liquid cold. Tears welled in his eyes, mingling freely with the sweat and dirt on his face. This was no coincidence. This was an answer, a testament. He had waited, he had listened in the stillness, and he had acted in faith on a seemingly foolish prompting. And here was the result. A hidden source revealed, a symbol of renewal made manifest. It was a tangible sign, a physical confirmation of the spiritual promise. They shall run and not be weary. He had run this race of obedience, and he had not grown weary. His strength had been renewed precisely for the task set before him. The water in the hole was more than H2O. It was a liquid testament to the faithfulness of God. Section 10. The Wings of Community. Word of Elias's project, once a subject of pitying gossip, began to shift as the news of his success spread through the rural community. The story of the old man digging a well by hand and finding water in the worst drought in 40 years was too remarkable to contain. The following Saturday morning, Elias was awakened not by his alarm, but by the sound of multiple vehicles rumbling down his driveway. He stepped onto the porch to see a small convoy of pickup trucks, and getting out were men from neighboring farms. Tom Henderson from the dairy farm down the road, the Jansen brothers, a few others he knew from town. They carried shovels, post-hole diggers, and even a small, portable mechanical auger. Tom, a burly man with a heart as big as his frame, spoke for the group. "Heard you found yourself a seep, Elias?" he said, a grin spreading across his face. "Figured you could use a hand turning it into a proper well. Can't have you hauling water in a bucket like some pioneer." It was a moment of sheer, unadulterated grace. These men, who had their own struggles and worries in the drought, were offering their time, their strength, and their resources. This was the body of Christ in action, the hands and feet of a God who provides through his people. It was the eagle's wings made manifest not in individual flight, but in the uplift of community, as they worked together, deepening the well, lining it with stones, setting up a proper hand pump. The farm, for the first time in years, was filled with the sounds of laughter, shared stories, and the blessed noise of communal labor. Elias felt a strength of a different kind renewing him, the strength of fellowship, of shared burden, of restored relationship. The farm was being saved not just by the physical water, but by the living water of love and community. The eagle was being carried on the wings of its kind. Section 11. The Deeper Current. The transformation of the seep into a proper, stone-lined well marked a tangible turning point, not just for the north pasture, but for Elias's entire perspective. The clear, cold water that now flowed steadily from the hand pump was a daily, physical reminder that the God he waited upon was actively involved in the minute details of his struggle. It was a testament to a provision that went beyond his own understanding. He had not used geological surveys or hydrological maps. He had followed a quiet, spiritual nudge, and it had led him to a hidden abundance. This well, however, was not the end of the journey, but rather the beginning of a deeper lesson. Samuel, upon hearing the news, visited again, his eyes twinkling with a knowing joy. "Water is a powerful symbol, Elias," he said, standing with him by the new well. "It speaks of life, of cleansing, of the Holy Spirit. But remember, the promise isn't just about finding a single source. It's about a continual renewal, a strength that is sustained like a never-failing spring." He gestured to the thriving green patch around them. "This is a miracle, yes, but the greater miracle is what happens next. Will you trust him with the next step and the next? The walking and not fainting is a marathon, not a sprint." His words settled in Elias's heart. The initial euphoria of success could have easily become a new thing to lean on, a point of pride. But Samuel was pointing him beyond the gift to the giver. The well was a signpost, not the destination. The true source of strength wasn't the water in the ground, but the relationship with the one who had led him to it. The challenge now was to continue waiting, continue listening, and not to assume that he now understood the pattern of God's provision. The current of trust had to run deeper than any single answered prayer. Section 12. The Unseen Enemy. Just as a fragile new normal began to establish itself, a different kind of drought threatened Elias's peace. It started with a series of small, vexing problems. A section of fence he had just repaired was mysteriously cut, not broken by an animal, but cleanly snipped. A few days later, he found several of his healthiest young fruit trees in the small orchard girdled, their bark stripped in a ring around the base, a death sentence for the trees. Then, one morning, he awoke to find the words, "Sell out," painted in crude, red letters on the side of his barn. It was no longer the impersonal force of nature or finance. This was a targeted human malice. The peace he had fought so hard to cultivate wavered. A hot, old anger began to simmer in his gut. His first instinct was to lean on his own understanding, to sit up all night with his shotgun, to confront his neighbors, to fight back with the same covert aggression. This was a problem he knew how to handle with force. The desire for retaliation was a powerful, seductive current. He found himself pacing the porch again, not in despair, but in fury, plotting his response. Felt justified, righteous even. But as he stewed, the memory of the well, of the green hollow, of the still, small voice, came back to him. Wait upon the Lord. What did that mean in the face of deliberate personal attack? Felt infinitely harder than waiting for rain. This was a test of the heart, a challenge to see if his trust would extend to protection and justice, or if he would take those matters back into his own hands. The eagle, learning to soar, was now facing a crosswind designed to throw it off course. Section 13. The hardest weight. The decision to not retaliate was, in many ways, more difficult than the decision to start digging the well. It went against every masculine, protective instinct he possessed. To do nothing felt like weakness, like surrender. He shared his troubles with Samuel over the phone, his voice tight with suppressed anger. Samuel listened, and then said quietly, "Elias, waiting on the Lord doesn't mean being a doormat, but it does mean entrusting your justice to him. Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord." That is perhaps the hardest part of the trust we're called to. It requires a strength that isn't our own, a patience that is supernatural. Taking this to heart, Elias made a conscious, agonizing choice. He would not sit with his shotgun. He would not spray paint retaliatory messages. Instead, he prayed. He prayed for the person who was doing this, for their heart, for whatever pain or greed was driving them. He prayed for protection over his land. And then, he acted in a way that defied his own understanding. He began to repair the damage without a word of accusation to anyone. He fixed the cut fence. He carefully tended the girdled trees, even as he knew it was likely futile. He painted over the ugly words on the barn, covering the hatred with a fresh, clean coat of white. It was an act of waiting, a waiting that responded to evil not with more evil, but with a stubborn, almost foolish commitment to goodness. It was a walking and not fainting through a moral landscape, a demonstration of a strength that was not of this world. Each stroke of the paintbrush was a declaration that his security was not found in the integrity of his fences, but in the faithfulness of his God. Section 14. The Confession. A few nights later, as Elias was finishing his evening chores, a battered truck he recognized as belonging to Dale, a struggling younger farmer who owned a plot down the road, pulled hesitantly into the yard. Dale got out, his posture slumped, his face a picture of shame and exhaustion. He didn't approach the house, but stood by his truck, waiting. Elias felt a lump in his throat, his anger warring with a sudden surge of pity. He walked out to meet him. "Elias?" Dale began, his voice cracking, unable to meet the older man's gaze. "It was me. I cut your fence. I girdled the trees. I painted the barn." He swallowed hard. "A big corporate agribusiness has been pressuring me to sell my land to them for months. They told me if I could make your life miserable enough, if I could drive down your property value, they could force you out and consolidate the plots. They promised me a job, a way out of my own debt." He finally looked up, his eyes filled with tears. "But then I saw you, painting over the mess I made. I saw you out there fixing the fence, not cursing, just working. And I heard about the well, how you dug it by hand. I couldn't live with myself." In that moment, Elias felt the last vestiges of his anger dissolve, replaced by an overwhelming sense of God's profound wisdom. His own understanding would have led to a feud, to more destruction, to a hardened heart. But waiting on the Lord, responding with grace instead of vengeance, had disarmed the situation completely. It had not only protected his own spirit from bitterness, but it had also become the very tool that broke his enemy and brought about a confession. The path of trust had led to a reconciliation his own efforts could never have achieved. Section 15. The Unexpected Alliance. The confession forged an unlikely and fragile bond between the two men. Instead of pressing charges or harboring resentment, Elias listened as Dale poured out his own struggles with debt and the predatory tactics of the large agribusiness. He realized they were not enemies, but fellow victims of a system that prized consolidation over community. Leaning on his own understanding would have seen Dale as a problem to be defeated, but waiting on the Lord allowed him to see a potential partner in need of grace. "You've been fighting this alone, son," Elias said, his voice gentle. "So have I in my own way. Maybe it's time we stopped." He offered Dale a deal. Instead of selling to the corporation, he could use the water from the new well to irrigate a portion of his own failing crops. In return, they could share labor and resources. It was a risk extending trust to the very person who had wronged him. But it was a risk born of the renewed strength he now possessed, a strength that made him generous instead of defensive. Dale, overwhelmed by the offer, readily agreed. The alliance was born not from a business plan, but from the overflow of a grace that Elias had first received in his own desperate waiting. The two farms, once isolated islands of struggle, became a tiny archipelago of mutual support. The eagle was not just soaring alone. It was teaching another to find the thermal currents. Section 16. The Multiplication. The partnership with Dale proved to be more fruitful than Elias could have imagined. With access to reliable water, Dale's land began to recover. More than that, Dale, being younger and more connected to modern agricultural trends, introduced Elias to new ideas. He talked about soil health, about cover cropping, about integrated pest management, concepts that were foreign to Elias's traditional methods, but complemented the sustainable approach he had stumbled upon with the well. It was a fusion of wisdom and innovation, of experience and new knowledge. They decided to pool a section of their adjoining lands and plant a high-value, drought-resistant crop, a particular variety of heritage beans that was in demand among local chefs. It was another step of faith, another venture outside of their collective own understanding. As they worked side by side, the dynamic shifted from mere survival to a shared vision. Elias found his own enthusiasm for the land rekindled as he learned from Dale, and Dale found a stability and mentorship he had been lacking. The community that had helped dig the well now saw this alliance as a beacon of hope. Other struggling farmers began to stop by, asking questions, sharing their own stories. An informal cooperative began to form, a network of shared knowledge and resources. The renewal of strength was multiplying, moving from Elias's individual spirit to the health of the land, and now to the fabric of the entire local farming community. The walk was becoming a shared journey. Section 17. The Return of the Sun. Michael's next visit was not announced. He simply drove up one Saturday afternoon, his expression a complex mix of apprehension and curiosity. The gossip about the well, the alliance with Dale, and the budding cooperative had even reached the city. He found his father not on the porch swing, but out in the field with Dale and a few other men, setting up an irrigation line from the well to the new shared plot. Elias saw him and waved, a genuine, unforced smile on his face. Michael stood and watched for a long time, seeing a man he barely recognized. A man who moved with purpose, who laughed easily, whose face, while still lined, was no longer etched with despair. Later, over dinner, Elias told him the whole story. He spoke not with boasting, but with a quiet testimony of the despair, the verse, the decision to wait, the digging, the malice, the confession, and the unexpected partnership. He talked about the peace that surpassed understanding. Michael listened, his engineer's mind struggling to compute the illogical sequence of events. "It doesn't make any sense," he finally said. But his tone was not argumentative, it was awed. By every metric, this should have failed. It's a series of irrational steps that led to a rational, positive outcome. "That's the point, son," Elias said softly. "I ran out of rational steps. I had to learn to trust in a wisdom higher than my own." Michael looked at his father, truly seeing the renewed strength, the eagle's wings that had been there all along, waiting for the right wind. For the first time, he didn't see stubbornness. He saw faith, and he began to wonder if his own understanding, for all its power, might have limits he had never acknowledged. Section 18. A new kind of strength. Michael stayed for the weekend, not as a consultant coming to fix a problem, but as a student, quietly observing this new ecosystem of hope his father was cultivating. He saw the way the other farmers looked to Elias not just for advice, but for his steady, calm spirit. He saw the respect between his father and Dale, a relationship built on forgiven wrongs and shared purpose. He helped with the irrigation lines, his city hands getting dirty, and felt a strange satisfaction in the physical work. On his last evening, he sat with his father on the porch. "I owe you an apology, Dad," Michael said, his voice thick with emotion. "I thought you were giving up. I thought faith was just wishful thinking. But what you've done here, it's not that. It's a different kind of strength, a stronger kind." Elias put a hand on his son's shoulder. "It's a strength that gets renewed, Michael. Mine ran out. This one doesn't." In that moment, Michael understood. The promise of Isaiah wasn't about a one-time infusion of power. It was about a continuous connection to a divine source. It was about trading the exhausting burden of self-reliance for the sustainable flow of grace. He saw that his father wasn't just saving a farm. He was being transformed. And he, the logical, pragmatic son, found himself wanting to understand that transformation, to learn this new way of being that could walk through fire and not be burned, through water and not be overwhelmed. The legacy he was being offered was far greater than a deed to a piece of land. It was the key to a resilient soul. Section 19. The First Harvest. The harvest of the heritage beans was a moment of collective triumph. The plants, nurtured by the well's water and the revitalized soil, had thrived despite the ongoing drought in the wider region. The yield was abundant, the quality exceptional. Local chefs, who had heard the story, were eager to buy the entire crop, paying a premium for produce with such a powerful narrative. The day they hauled the first sacks to market was a celebration. It wasn't just a financial victory, though it certainly staved off the immediate threat of foreclosure. It was a validation of every difficult, counterintuitive step of faith Elias had taken. It was the tangible fruit of waiting, of trusting, of forgiving, and of partnering. As Elias held a handful of the beautiful, mottled beans, he thought of the tiny, fragile seed of hope that had been planted in his heart when he first read Isaiah 40 verse 31. That seed had been watered with tears of surrender, weeded through trials of doubt and malice, and had now produced a harvest that could feed not just his body, but his spirit and the spirit of his community. The bank's notice was still a reality, but it no longer held the power of a death sentence. It was just a piece of paper. The real currency was the hope in the air, the solidarity among the farmers, and the undeniable evidence that God was directing their paths. They had run the race of the growing season, and they were not weary. They were filled with a joyful energy for the next season. Section 20. The Offering. With the first significant income from the bean harvest, Elias faced a new test of his trust. His own understanding screamed at him to hoard every penny, to pour it all into paying down the mountain of debt. It was the logical, responsible thing to do. But as he prayed, he felt a different prompting, one that seemed to make no financial sense whatsoever. He felt led to set aside a portion of the money, a tithe not for the bank but for Dale. Dale's farm was still on shaky ground, and this infusion of capital, given freely as a gift, not a loan, would ensure his survival and solidify their partnership. It was an act of trust that the God who had provided the beans would also provide for the debt. When Elias handed Dale the envelope, the younger man broke down. It was a grace he knew he did not deserve, a demonstration of an economy based on kingdom principles, not worldly fear. That same week, Elias wrote a check to the bank for a substantial payment, attaching a letter explaining the new cooperative and their plan for sustainable profitability. It was not a plea, but a confident statement of fact. The act of giving first to Dale had, paradoxically, solidified his own faith that the rest would be taken care of. It was the ultimate leaning not on his own understanding, trusting that generosity was a better investment than fearful scarcity. The eagle, soaring high, could afford to drop a feather, knowing it was held by a force greater than itself. Section 21. The Long Walk. The success of the harvest brought a new phase to Elias's journey. The dramatic moments of crisis, the storm, the malice, the confession, were replaced by the steady, unglamorous work of building a future. This was the walking and not fainting in its purest form. It was the daily discipline of tending the soil, managing the cooperative, mentoring Dale, and slowly, methodically, chipping away at the debt. There were no more spectacular miracles, just the quiet, persistent evidence of God's faithfulness in the mundane. A timely rain would come just when the seedlings needed it. A new market for their produce would open up. A piece of equipment would be offered to them at a price they could afford. Elias learned that the renewed strength promised in Isaiah was not just for the sprint of crisis, but for the marathon of life. It was a strength that manifested as endurance, as patience, as a deep and abiding peace that remained unshaken by the small setbacks that were part of any farming enterprise. He found joy in the process itself, in the feeling of the sun on his back, the smell of the turned earth, the shared laughter with his new friends. The walk was no longer a burden. It was a privilege. He was walking with God, and that made all the difference. Section 22. The Legacy of Wings. A year after the first foreclosure notice, the farm was not just surviving. It was becoming a model. The story of the well and the cooperative had spread, attracting the attention of agricultural extension agents and even a local newspaper. People came to see the man who had dug a well by faith and the community that had risen around it. Michael visited more frequently now, often bringing schematics for more efficient irrigation or business plans for the cooperative. But his approach had changed. He no longer dictated, he collaborated. He had begun his own journey of learning to trust, to see the world through the lens of faith as well as logic. One evening, he asked his father, "Dad, what's the one thing you want me to remember from all this? What's the core of it?" Elias didn't hesitate. "It's that the strength was always there, son. It just wasn't my own. I was like an eagle trying to run on the ground, exhausting myself, when I was created to soar on currents I couldn't see. Waiting on the Lord is learning to recognize those currents, to stretch out your wings, and to let Him lift you. It's not about avoiding the storms. It's about finding the wind in the midst of them that will carry you above it." He was no longer just leaving Michael a farm. He was leaving him the secret to a life of sustained strength and purpose. He was passing on the legacy of the eagle's wings. Section 23. The circle closes. The final closure came in an unexpected way. The large agribusiness, frustrated in its attempts to acquire the land, made a direct, substantial offer to Elias for his farm, an offer that would have cleared all his debt and left him a wealthy man. It was the ultimate test. Leaning on his own understanding, it was the perfect exit strategy, the reward for all his suffering. He could retire in comfort, travel, be free. He prayed over it for days, wrestling once more. But the peace he had fought so hard for was absent. Instead, he felt a clear conviction that this was not the path. The farm was no longer just his. It was a vessel of hope for a small community, a testament to a promise. To sell it now would be to betray the very journey God had led him on. He declined the offer. A week later, a letter arrived from the bank. In light of his consistent payments, the success of the cooperative business model, and the community development it represented, they were restructuring his loan with dramatically better terms. The path of trust had led not to an escape, but to a restoration more meaningful than any buyout. The circle was closed. The threat was gone. The eagle had not been rescued from the wilderness. It had made the wilderness its home, and in doing so, had found its true freedom. Section 24. They that wait. 5 years later, the Thorn Farm was unrecognizable from the desolate place it had been. The fields were lush and diverse, a patchwork of crops rotating in healthy succession. The cooperative had grown, including half a dozen local families, and had its own brand and a loyal customer base. Elias, now in his late 70s, was the revered elder statesman, his wisdom sought by young and old alike. Michael had eventually left his city job and moved back, partnering with Dale to manage the business with a blend of sharp acumen and hard-won faith. One Sunday morning, Elias stood with his young grandson on the porch, pointing out a large eagle circling high above the north pasture, riding the thermal currents with effortless grace. "See that, Ben?" Elias said, his voice soft. "He's not flapping, he's just waiting. He's found the wind, and he's trusting it to hold him up." The boy watched, mesmerized. "How does he find it, Grandpa?" Elias smiled, his heart full. "He waits for it, son. He waits upon the Lord." In that moment, Elias knew the promise of Isaiah 40 verse 31 was not a one-time event, but a continuous, lifelong reality. They that wait upon the Lord do renew their strength. They mount up with wings as eagles, not just once, but every time they choose trust over fear, every time they choose to wait on the Creator rather than lean on their own crumbling understanding. The walking, the running, the soaring. It was all a gift of grace, available to all who would have the courage to be still, to listen, and to wait. Section 25. And not faint. The legacy of the farm was secure, but more importantly, the legacy of faith was alive and growing. Elias's story was told and retold, not as a fairy tale with a perfect ending, but as a testimony of gritty, real-world trust. There would be other droughts, other economic pressures, other storms, but the lesson had been learned. The strength was not in the soil or the bank account or even in their own bodies. It was in the steadfast, ever-renewing presence of God. Elias, in the final years of his life, embodied the last part of the verse with a quiet power that spoke louder than any sermon, and not faint. He had walked through the valley of the shadow of death and debt, and he had not fainted. He had run the race of obedience, and he had not grown weary. He had mounted up on the wings of an eagle, and he had seen his world from a perspective he never knew existed. And now, as the sun set on his life, he walked with a steady, unhurried pace, his heart at peace, his spirit strong. He had learned the secret. He had waited upon the Lord, and he had not been disappointed. The promise was true. For Elias, for Michael, for Dale, for the whole community, and for all who would hear the story, the invitation remained open, to trade weariness for wings, and to discover a strength that never, ever fails. They that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings as eagles. They shall run and not be weary, and they shall walk and not faint. It was and always would be the truest thing he knew.